Part 1, The Abduction, a Fragile Prisoner in a Cruel Experiment. The cold, sterile walls of the Malnak research vessel Relentless Inquiry seemed to pulse with a quiet menace, their smooth metallic surfaces reflecting the dim, artificial glow of overhead lights that did little to warm the air. In Cell 7B, the Zion female known as Lyra sat motionless, her slender frame trembling ever so slightly as she wrapped her arms around herself, claws pressing into the delicate, scaled flesh of her forearms. Her bioluminescent markings, normally a serene, shifting blue, now flickered erratically between streaks of panicked yellow and deep, fearful violet, betraying the terror she fought to contain. The Malnak had not bothered to adjust the atmospheric settings to accommodate her species' needs. The air was too dry, too thin, laced with trace elements that burned her secondary lungs with every shallow breath. She had tried to explain, to plead in the soft, melodic tones of her native tongue, but the scientists had only stared at her with those cold, multi-lensed eyes, recording her distress without comprehension. To them, she was not a living being, she was specimen Z-447, another data point in their so-called Confluence project, an experiment designed to test the limits of interspecies interaction under duress. The chief xenobiologist, a towering Malnak named Vexus, had barely glanced at her file before ordering her transferred to the holding chamber, his voice devoid of anything resembling empathy as he rattled off her physiological specifications to an underling. Zion subspecies, aquatic evolutionary lineage, empathic sensitivity rating, high. Note, stress-induced mortality probable under prolonged exposure to non-native environments. The words had been spoken with the same clinical detachment one might use to describe the properties of a lab reagent. Nearby, Security Officer Krax had snorted, his armored exoskeleton clicking as he adjusted the containment field around her cell. Waste of resources if you ask me, he muttered to a colleague. Look at her, no combat adaptations, no natural defenses. Even the Vree hatchlings could tear her apart. What's the point? Vexus had responded with a dismissive flick of his secondary appendages. The Confederacy wants data on empathic species. Something about improving diplomatic relations. Frankly, I doubt she'll survive the first phase. Lyra's gill slits flared as another wave of dry, chemical-tinged air hit her, and she squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the overwhelming tide of hostile emotions pressing against her mind. The Malnak were not a cruel species by nature, just indifferent, so utterly detached from the concept of suffering that they could dissect it without remorse. And that was almost worse. She had heard whispers of the Confluence Chamber, a nightmarish space where captured beings from across the galaxy were forced together, their reactions monitored as they struggled to coexist under artificial stressors. Some broke. Some fought. Some died. And now, she was next. Part 4, The Forbidden Pact, When Survival Demands Sacrifice. Absolute darkness swallowed the chamber whole, a suffocating void where even Lyra's bioluminescent markings seemed to drown in the oppressive blackness. For 3 terrifying heartbeats, there was only the sound of ragged breathing and the skittering of claws against metal as the specimens reeled from the sudden sensory deprivation. Then the screaming started, first the Lyrian, their crystalline form shattering further as they stumbled blindly into an electrified barrier, their agonized wail piercing the dark like broken glass. The Vree snarled, lashing out at unseen threats, while the Tarkisian's thunderous roars shook the chamber walls. Lyra froze, her empathic senses overwhelmed by the tsunami of panic and pain crashing against her psyche. She might have collapsed entirely if not for the human's grip on her wrist, an anchor in the storm. Jace didn't speak. Instead, his calloused fingers tapped rapidly against her skin in a pattern she dimly recognized as Galactic Morse, a rudimentary code used by fringe traders and, apparently, prisoners desperate to communicate silently. Play dead, his touch commanded. Before she could process the order, he yanked her downward, shielding her body with his own as the chaos erupted around them. Something warm and wet, blood, splattered across her arm as the Vria's enraged shrieks reached a fever pitch. The stench of ozone and burning flesh filled the air as another specimen found the electrified barriers. Then, a whisper against her ear, so faint she might have imagined it, "When I move, follow." Don't hesitate. A click. A spark. Jace's stolen tool, a smuggled hydrospanner from his engineering duties, flared to life in his palm, its dim glow revealing the horror around them. The Vree had impaled the Tarkisian on his own talons, both creatures locked in a death grapple. The Lyrisian lay motionless, their fractured bodies shimmering like discarded glass. And there, in the far wall, barely visible behind a partition, a maintenance hatch. Jace didn't wait. Dragging Lyra with him, he lunged, dodging the Vree's flailing limbs. The hatch resisted for one heart-stopping second before groaning open, revealing a cramped duct barely large enough for a human to crawl through. "Go," he hissed, shoving her forward. Lyra hesitated. "The others." "Can't be saved," Jace cut in, his eyes reflecting the distant glow of emergency sirens. "But you can. Move." Behind them, the chamber doors hissed. Reinforcements were coming. Part 2, The Confluence Chamber, a Battle of Survival. The doors to the Confluence Chamber hissed open with a sound like a dying creature's last breath, and Lyra stumbled forward as the Malnak guards shoved her inside, their clawed hands gripping her arms with impersonal efficiency before withdrawing quickly, as if afraid her fragility might be contagious. The chamber was vast, a domed arena of polished black alloy, its curved walls embedded with shimmering sensors that tracked every movement, every fluctuation in heart rate, every spike of adrenal response. The air here was a sickly compromise, thick with the conflicting atmospheric needs of its unwilling occupants, a hazy cocktail of oxygen, nitrogen, and trace gases that burned Lyra's lungs as she struggled to find a pocket where she could breathe without pain. Around her, the other specimens watched with varying degrees of hostility, curiosity, or blank resignation. There was a Vree warrior, his chitinous armor clicking as he shifted, his 4 black eyes scanning for threats, a slender, androgynous being from the crystalline colonies of Lyris, 3, their body refracting the dim light into prismatic shards, a hulking, furred creature from the ice worlds of Tarkis, its breath steaming in the artificial cold of its designated corner. And then there was him, the human. He was smaller than she'd expected, his frame lean but wiry with muscle, his skin marked with faded scars that told stories of survival rather than conquest. Unlike the others, he wasn't pacing or snarling or retreating into himself, he was sitting cross-legged near the center of the chamber, his dark eyes sharp with an intelligence that seemed out of place in this sterile hellscape. The Malnak had labeled him Specimen H-12, but Lyra had overheard one of the technicians call him Jace. He didn't look like the monsters from the stories her people told about humans, the ruthless conquerors, the species that had clawed its way to dominance in a galaxy that had tried to break them. No, this man looked tired. And when his gaze met hers, just for a second, she felt something she hadn't since her abduction, a flicker of recognition, of connection. But the moment shattered as the chamber's speakers crackled to life, Vexus's voice dripping with detached amusement. Commencing Phase 1. Specimens, you will compete for resources. Failure to engage will result in disciplinary measures. A section of the floor slid open, revealing a pitiful spread of rations, some raw meat for the Vree, a cluster of mineral shards for the Lyrisian, a frozen block of protein for the Tarkisian. And for Lyra? A small, nutrient-rich gel pack, the kind used to feed sickly lab animals. The Vree was the first to move, his mandibles twitching in anticipation as he lunged for the meat, and chaos erupted. The Lyrisian darted forward, their crystalline fingers closing around a shard just as the Tarkisian roared and swiped at them, sending them skidding across the floor. Lyra didn't move. She couldn't. Her body was shutting down, her empathic senses overwhelmed by the raw, unfiltered aggression crashing against her like a tidal wave. She barely registered the human, Jace, until he was suddenly there, stepping between her and the Vree, his voice low but firm. Back off. The Vree hissed, but something in the human's stance made him hesitate. And then the chamber's lights flashed red, and the real experiment began. Part 3, The Human Exception, a Spark of Defiance in the Dark. The chamber's red emergency lighting bathed everything in a bloody hue, transforming the sterile observation room into something far more sinister, a gladiatorial pit where survival was the only currency that mattered. Lyra pressed herself against the wall, her bioluminescent markings flaring a frantic violet as she struggled to process the sudden shift in atmosphere. The Vree warrior had frozen mid-lunge, his chitinous plates rattling in alarm as hidden vents along the chamber's perimeter hissed open, releasing a thin, acrid mist that stung Lyra's eyes and made her secondary lungs constrict in protest. Atmospheric stressor introduced, Vexus's voice announced, clinical and devoid of remorse. Observe specimen reactions. The Lyrisian let out a keening wail as the mist made contact with their crystalline skin, sending hairline fractures spiderwebbing across their forearm. The Tarkisian roared, swiping at the air as if it could fight the unseen threat, while the Vree scrambled backward, hissing in a language that needed no translation, pain, betrayal, fury. Only the human, Jace, remained eerily still, his jaw clenched as he breathed through his nose, his dark eyes locked onto the observation window where the Malnak scientists stood watching. Lyra could feel the storm of emotions radiating off him, not fear, not panic, but something far more dangerous, cold, calculating rage. Then the floor trembled. A section of it retracted, revealing a yawning pit from which rose a series of jagged, electrified barriers, cutting the chamber into uneven segments and forcing the occupants apart, or together. The message was clear: interact or suffer. The Vree, now cornered near Lyra, whirled on her, his mandibles dripping with venom. Weak thing, he spat in broken galactic common. You die first. Make more space for rest of us. Lyra's gills flared, her body screaming at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. She braced herself. And then Jace was there, moving faster than she'd thought possible for a human. He didn't attack the Vree. Instead, he grabbed Lyra's wrist and yanked her behind him, his other hand raised in a gesture that was neither submission nor threat. She's no use to you dead, he said, his voice rough but steady. But he jerked his chin toward the observation window. Want us to kill each other? You really gonna play their game? The Vree hesitated. For all his brutality, he wasn't stupid. Jace pressed the advantage. You want out? Then we use each other. Her species reads emotions. Mine. We manipulate them. His grin was all teeth. Let's give the Malnak a show they won't forget. Lyra's pulse pounded in her throat. She could feel the Vree's suspicion warring with his hunger for vengeance, the Lyrisian's fragile hope, the Tarkisian's simmering confusion. And Jace? His mind was a locked box, but his hand on her wrist was warm, his grip just tight enough to say trust me without words. Then the speakers crackled again. Unanticipated cooperation detected, Vexus mused, intrigued. Introducing secondary variable.